So since I didn't show you, I'll show this. See that little edge on the elevator that's open? That we will fill, and I'm filling it with any kind of putty will do. I happen to use this kind of putty, but anything would work. Heck, Bondo would probably work. And this is exactly what I did on the fuselage. So I took a little bit and plopped it right into the gap, and you'll see that I kind of push it in and I feather it on the sides. Usually use my fingers. Most people use things like toothpicks and such, but I find your fingers are probably the best tool there is. It gets messy, but comes off with lacquer thinner without too much trouble. I've already had my children, so, it's not going to hurt me. But you make sure that there's filler in the crack, and you overfill it, which is fine. And here I'm tapping it in a little bit more, just to make sure it gets in there. And then when it's all dry, which doesn't take long, this stuff dries, within minutes, really. The thicker it is, you let it dry longer. And then you can come back with your sandpaper and sand it down. But this is exactly the procedure I did with the fuselage. I just felt guilty not showing you. It's dry, and now I take some sandpaper, and I take the still pretty thin sandpaper. That's that 220 or 180 or something. And I really carefully, using my thumb as a backing, I just go through and I kind of sand it. I kind of use circular motions, and you're trying to just get rid of the excess. And you go on both top and bottom, and then you go a little bit around the front edge where the hole was. And what you do then is spray it again, and if it's not right, you go back, and it probably won't be. You go back and you put a little more in, and you just keep doing that till you're satisfied. And there it is, clean as a whistle. Not hard at all. Okay, so now on to painting. So I used this color of a light blue. I started with that. It actually was, I had white mixed in there. I made it lighter than it was before. So I added some white into that blue color. So it's slightly lighter than what the acrylic paint was supposed to be. And then there's some green. My idea was the bottom of a Fokker is supposed to be a turquoise blue. So I thought, well, I can mix some green into that and I'll get a little turquoise. And I want to show you how I played around with it. I'm not really good with colors, and you'll see that that's the case. But what I did was very freely mix these in little bits at a time, because the dark green will really wreak havoc. In this first batch, you take it and you spin it around, and I got something that looked a little too gray. So then I tried to blue it up a little bit. So I added some blue, and I got that color, which isn't bad, but I thought I needed a different green, maybe a brighter green. So I tried a different green. This is a green I use like in interiors for my World War II airplanes, American and British airplanes and stuff. Tried that, got a little better. See, that's not bad, but still lame. And then I decided to make it a little bluer, adding a little tiny bit more blue, but it still isn't quite the way I wanted it. And then I had an epiphany, and I thought, clear green. So this is the color I use on the end of wingtip lights and things. So I added that in there in increments and ended up with, I think, a really nice color. So here I test it on the bottom of the fuselage just to see with a brush, to see how it looks. And it doesn't look bad. It's just a little dark. So I decided, especially for scale effect, you're supposed to lighten things. So I just lightened it with a little bit of white and put a little bit on the bottom. You'll see it in a second. That's a horrible picture. And there's the lightened one. That looks pretty dang good. So, stopping right there. And I label it, I think, Fokker Blue. Can't really tell. But now I've got enough in that jar that will last me for all the bottom parts that I need to do, the wings basically left, and any kind of touch-up. So, perfect. I got my color ready to go. So now there's my airbrush and there's my blue. And later on, I figured out how to set the camera so you get a slightly better angle. But you put your little blue into your airbrush. You don't need much paint at all. And this was actually thin enough. Usually you got to thin it with isopropanol in my case, or your thinner of choice. I always test it either on the bench or on a little piece of paper. Make sure I got a good flow. and you just go ahead and spray, and you just treat this like it's a plastic model. For those of you who've built plastic models before, you just start spraying. And it's a lacquer primer on there, so it basically is like a plastic at this point. And off you go. And I sped this up because nothing's exciting to see. I also made sure I got the sides, because on this airplane, the turquoise is a little tiny thin strip that goes around the sides on the fuselage, and on the tails for that matter. But the tails are going to be painted a different color. So here's more of the same. Now this seems long and drawn out, but the reason it is, a little blue tack here lets me stick the rudder down on the bench so it won't blow away, and just hit that with a little bit of white. I think later on I try to show you how I physically mix the paint to what consistency. Again, hang in there. The angle gets a little better in a little while. But for those people who haven't airbrushed before, this is, it's all pretty simple. Maybe this is the one I'm showing. I hope this is the one. I had a little isopropanol, which is a thinner I use for this Tamiya paint, and stir it up. And if you look into the cup, I'm going to touch the edge of the cup with the brush, and you might see the consistency at which it flows down the side. I actually needed a little more. I thinned it too much, so I had to go back and put a little bit more white paint in there. And I think what I do is I put it, and you watch when I touch, my stupid fingers get out of the way. If I touch the inside, see how it runs down at that speed, almost like milk. See how it kind of comes down? I hope that's visible in the final. That's about the consistency you want. Too thick, it splatters. Too thin, it won't cover. Anywho, that's a basic piece of airbrush thinning for you. Paint the rudder. And then I decided, while I'm here, I use like an olive drab color to paint the cowling, because the cowling and the upper parts around the cockpit are going to be just a solid olive drabish color, like what Fokker did, I guess, at the factory, and which we'll do, except for our stabilizers are going to be kind of fun to paint. Everything else is going to be factory, and then we'll put some cool markings on the fuselage side. So there it is, all painted. Now, I maybe did this backwards. Maybe I should have done this later, but what I'm trying to do here is cut a thin strip of this Tamiya yellow tape. Use it for masking all my plastic models and stuff. Works really, really well. And what I do is I'm going to put it along the fuselage lower longeron there in a very thin layer, edging just on the edge. And the idea is that now when we paint everything else, like it's going to be clear dope linen, and then we're going to put some streaks on it of olive drab. But when I pull off this yellow tape, I hope I will get a very thin line, and that thin line will be turquoise, and it will be folded up around the bottom edge. If it doesn't work, I can also tape it later and then just brush paint it. So it'll work either way, but that's what I'm doing here. If it looks weird, taping off so that I'll have a little turquoise edge all the way up, and that's why I painted the lower sides with the turquoise color, with that light blue. So I got that all the way up. It's all ready to go, and I'm going to paint the yellow pieces where the crosses are going to go and the stabilizer, but I need to mask the bottom because it'll get painted white accidentally. So I use this tape and put it on the bottom, and it's just a masking tape, but it's like a post-it note paint or tape. Now, when you airbrush, to make a finer line, you take off that front little cup piece, that front little knurled tip, and you'll actually get different airflow, and you'll be able to paint stuff very, very thin and very carefully, very strategically. Really good for like Luftwaffe camouflage things. Anyway, back here is going to be a big white square that'll be masked off, but that's where one of our crosses is going to go. So I'll paint the other side the very same, as well as paint the stabilizer top and bottom of the stabilizer, because it's going to be a black and white striped at some point. So go ahead and paint the other side, and then paint the top and bottom of the stabilizer.